A man is walking through the park with a large group of followers behind him. Everything the man does, his followers do too. He yells, "Hula, hula!" The followers yell, "Hula, hula!" He crouches like a tiger. They crouch like a tiger. He walks like a monkey. They walk like a monkey. They do everything he does. An old friend of the man observes this behavior from a distance. He then walks up to the man and says, "My friend, what are you doing? Who are these people? Why are they imitating you?" The man says, "Oh, I've become a spiritual leader. These are my followers. I'm guiding them to enlightenment." His friend asks, "How do you know when they've reached enlightenment?" "That's easy. Every morning we gather in the park and I take a roll call. And those who are missing have reached enlightenment." So, my talk this morning is on intellectual independence, on what this is, what it isn't, and why it's so important, why we need it. Now, this first example is a great example of what it's not, right? This is the sort of an exaggerated version of what, just following blindly a leader looks like. And very few people do that. But variations on that, or lesser degrees of that, are fairly common, and I'm sure you're all familiar with people who engage in such behavior. So what I want to do is I want to talk briefly about what intellectual independence is from just a cursory perspective, where we all kind of already know what this thing is. I mean, I don't think there's anybody in the room who couldn't tell me what intellectual independence is. But I want to then dig deeper because it's actually a complex idea. There's a lot more to it than the initial description would indicate. So we'll begin with a cursory definition or at least description of what this thing is. So what does it mean to be intellectually independent? Well, it means to go by the judgment of your own mind, your own intellect, right? So you look at reality, you decide for yourself what makes sense to you, what seems to be true, and what seems to be right and good, and then you act on that. And that's your MO, that's your way of facing the world. As against what? What's the contrast for this? Well, it's intellectual dependence, right? Just keeping it simple, the immediate opposite is intellectual dependence, whereby you turn, instead of looking at reality yourself, you turn to other people to see what their views are about what's true, what's right, what's good. And you mimic them, in effect, the way that the followers were mimicking the leader. And again, very few people do it completely that way. But a lot of people do, to some extent, relinquish their own judgment to either an authority or to a group, or to a god, or to something outside of them, something that is not their intellect. And that is intellectual dependence. That's the basic difference between these, just in terms of a cursory description. Another way to think about this is that the intellectually independent person has a primary focus on reality. So he still is concerned to some extent with what other people think and do and believe. He's not ignoring them entirely, but he's got a primary focus on reality. That's his go-to. Versus the intellectual dependent who has a primary focus on other people. He might look at facts on occasion, but his primary focus is what do other people think, what do other people value, and then he mimics. So those are the descriptions that I think you're probably all familiar with. There's nothing new there. But the devil is in the details, and the clarity is in the details too. So I want to dive into the details here and unpack this idea to some extent. The first thing I want to do is to distinguish between intellectual independence and its closest relative, independent thinking. Now, a lot of people might think that these are the same thing, and they're very similar, and it's understandable that you might think they're the same thing. But there's a subtle difference between them that will become not so subtle after we start to break it apart, that makes a big difference. This is a difference that makes a big difference. So let's talk about what these two things are. Independent thinking, or thinking for yourself, I take those as synonymous, means just that. You're thinking for yourself. You're going to make your own decision about this thing or that thing. You're thinking for yourself. You're using your own mind for this. But thinking for yourself, or independent thinking, can be fleeting. Somebody can think independently today and not tomorrow, or on this issue but not on that issue. And this happens very, very often. People will think independently in, say, the field of politics, but not in the field of ethics. All right, so this is why you have a lot of people who say, look, freedom is something we need for life. You got to have freedom, and they'll stand on freedom, but then and they'll do that against all tides, right? A lot of libertarians will do this. But then when it comes to ethics, well, whatever I was raised with is a perfectly good ethics. I'm not going to challenge that. So if they were raised with the idea that self-sacrifice is a virtue, they don't challenge that. Now, I'm not saying right now whether self-sacrifice is or isn't a virtue. The question is not the conclusion, it's the approach, it's the method. It's the whether or not you question this thing, whether or not you think about it yourself. So thinking for yourself, or independent thinking, can be fleeting, whereas intellectual independence is a character trait that you develop and maintain. It's a way of being. It's an enduring quality that you make yourself into. So it's not fleeting. It's as Aristotle put it, it's a habit. Aristotle talked about the virtues as being habits. And intellectual independence is a characteristic, an enduring characteristic that you form and make habitual in your life. It's your MO, it's what you do. I think for myself on principle and always. So I want to make this crystal clear with some examples, because it's a subtle distinction, but I think it's a really important distinction. So I've got two examples that I want to put on the table and then talk about. And I promise I will not read at you much today. I'm a horrible out loud reader because I'm dyslexic. So I'm going to read a few paragraphs, and bear with me if I stumble. But I want to read this one example because there are some details in here that if I get wrong, it's not going to work as an example. So I want to read, and this is. I was rereading Ayn Rand's Art of Nonfiction recently, and right in the last few pages of that book, I came to this example, which I had read before, and then I was like, oh my God, that's so rich. So I want to share this with you, and then we'll unpack it a bit. When I began my first job as a screenwriter, I had some idea of how to write a script, but I didn't know the technical terminology. When I arrived at Warner Brothers to work on the movie of The Fountainhead, I asked for a sample script, and I was given one. I was also given a secretary to provide me with any help I needed. I never had to ask her a question. I simply looked at the script and figured out what was meant by close-up, dissolve, fade out, etc. For example, I observed that fade out referred to the end of a sequence. Now, fade out to a few years later. I'm working for Hal Wallace at Paramount. Wallace had bought an original story which was intelligent and had good dialogue. But, he told me, he was disappointed in the screenwriter who had also written the story. This is important. The screenwriter had also written the story. He was disappointed in the screenwriter because although the story was good, the screenplay was a mess. He asked me to take a look at it. I did, and I could not understand the screenplay. It had a close-up where the action did not necessitate one. There was a long shot when only one person was in the room, and so on. None of the technical directions matched the action of the story. I asked the screenwriter how he decided where to use a particular direction. He said he had asked for a sample script to see how it was done, and then he followed it exactly. If the sample opened with a close-up, he opened with a close-up. If 2 pages later there was a long shot, he marked a long shot 2 pages later. Ultimately, I had to make a great many changes and rewrite some sequences, and so I received part credit. This incident impressed me because on my first job, I too had asked for a sample script, but I looked for the abstract format and knew that I had to fit that abstraction to my own story. He took the format of his sample literally. He was a conformist. He never asked himself why there were certain technical indications at specific points. He never observed that close-ups, long shots, dissolves followed a certain pattern. He was a ritualist and followed the sample dogmatically on blind faith. I do not think this person ever wrote anything else, although he had made a promising start. Now, I find this story really fascinating in light of what we're talking about here. Because what it shows is that a person can think for himself in a certain area and then fail to do it in another area, and what happens? There's no way this guy wrote a compelling story with good dialogue that was really rich. I mean, that's why Hal Wallace took it. Ayn Rand even saw that in it, or she wouldn't have worked on the project, right? He had done some thinking, but when it came to another aspect, and also an important aspect, he threw his own thinking out the window. He didn't ask himself, what is the meaning of this stuff? He didn't ask himself, what are the facts and how does this relate to my context, et cetera, et cetera. And what was the result? Looks like he failed in his career. It looks like this was really damaging. I don't know who the guy was. He's not mentioned in the story. But it looks like his failure to think for himself ruined his career. Thinking for yourself, being intellectually independent, is a crucial aspect of human life. Mimicking, following other people's lead mindlessly doesn't work. It doesn't work because it means that your mind is not connected to reality. It means that your mind is not in touch with the facts. He needed his mind to be in touch with the facts about what close-up means, what long shot means, what the purpose of these things is, and he failed there, and it cost him his career. So we can see here one ingredient of intellectual independence is, so we already know that intellectual independence consists in large part of thinking for yourself. But now we can add an ingredient to that. It's thinking for yourself as a matter of principle, always, right? Not just today, or not just on this point, but all points and all the time, right? So thinking for yourself as a matter of principle, that's what we can fold in with that example. All right, I want to give another example that will help us fold in another ingredient. This comes from a book by a friend of mine, Ira Chalif, titled Intelligent Disobedience. And this is a great story that will paint another aspect of this, I think, very clearly. So a family is driving along the California coast on the Pacific Coast Highway, and this is between Big Sur and San Francisco. And if you've ever driven that coast, it's just breathtaking. It's just beautiful. And all along the way, there are these sheer cliffs right beside your car that just drop straight down into the ocean. And down at the bottom, there are often these little narrow beaches. And when the tide goes out, there's a little bit of sand. And when the tide comes in, the huge waves are just bashing up against these cliffs. And so it's just a scenic, and the scenery, the sound, everything is just magnificent. And the family gets out of their car to do some sightseeing. And when they're done, they've been looking around for about 20 or 30 minutes. And the father says, okay, we got to get back on the road, everybody in the car. And the two kids say, Dad, we heard voices down the edge of this cliff yelling for help. And the father says, well, let me see. And he comes up and he listens for a minute, and he doesn't hear anything. He says, I think you probably just heard a bird or the wind or something. Get in the car, we got to get going. And his father turns around and starts walking off. And the kids say, no, we heard human voices down there. We heard human voices calling for help. So the dad comes and he listens again for a minute, and he doesn't hear anything. He says, look, kids, I know you guys think you heard something, but we got to get going. We got a lot to do today. We got to get on the road. He turns around and starts walking. And these kids go, no, Dad, you need to call the police. You need to call the police. We heard people yelling for help. So the father reluctantly calls the highway patrol, and they show up with a search and rescue team. And sure enough, in short order, they find a group of people down there stranded on a narrow beach with the tide coming in. This was a life or death situation. Kudos to these kids for holding their ground. And kudos to their father for respecting their minds ultimately. This is a good dad. I mean, he had reason to sort of doubt, I think, initially, but then he was like, okay, they heard something. So kudos to both parties here. But what I really want to point out is what did these kids, what happened here, intellectually speaking? What did these kids do? They mustered courage to stand their ground against an authority. Their father, who sounds like they had a good relationship and they were appreciative of their father and vice versa, so this sounded like a healthy family. Their father is a man who was, probably a hero to them of sorts, certainly an authority in their lives of sorts. And he was telling them, no, you're not hearing that, get in the car. And he told them twice, maybe thrice. And they held their ground and they said, no, we're not going, Dad. We're going to stand our ground. So they mustered courage. And this is the ingredient that I want to fold in here. As C.S. Lewis put it, courage is not simply one of the virtues. It's the form of every virtue at the testing point. It's the form of every virtue at the testing point. And if you think about it, it's true. It's really easy to uphold the virtues when there's no controversy in it, there's no pressure, there's no difficulty. Yeah, I'm thinking for myself. Here, I'm going along this way, and I'm thinking for myself. Everybody else seems to be thinking in the same direction. When the rubber meets the road, when you can tell whether you or anyone else is really intellectually independent, is when it's controversial to uphold what you see and think to be true. That's when you can tell the difference, right? It's very easy to be honest most of the time, but then, they could take a bank robbery. He's honest, 90% of the time, and he just swindles or defrauds or whatever, or steals money, on occasion. You don't call this person honest. You say, no, this is a dishonest person. Well, likewise, a person who is intellectually independent isn't someone who is intellectually independent when it's easy, when it's convenient. It's someone who is intellectually independent regardless of ease, regardless of convenience, as a matter of principle. So I think you can see here that there are three ingredients, at least three key ingredients to intellectual independence. Thinking for yourself, that's the fairly obvious one. Having a standing order to do that as a matter of principle, so a commitment to thinking for yourself always. As a matter of principle, that's the second ingredient. And the third is having courage and enacting the courage to follow through on that commitment, even when the going gets tough, even when there's some authority or something pressuring you in another direction. I want to loop back to why this matters. If our thinking is to serve us in reality, it has to be connected to reality, right? If you buy into other people's ideas, you have no idea whether they're connected to reality. It's just subjectivism. It's just one subject to another subject getting something. There's no connection down to the ground. What does it mean to understand something? It means to know what stands under that thing, what stands under that idea and connects it to reality. That's what understanding is. It's got a conveniently descriptive name, what stands under this thing. And so what does it mean to make sense? What does it mean to make sense? It means that the idea makes it to sensory perception. You can ultimately see the facts that anchor this thing in reality. And that when we hold ideas that way, when we derive our ideas that way, and when that is our standard for acceptance of ideas, that is independence. And that's what works, because it means that your mind is connected to the realm of values, reality. So this is really, really important, and I want to hit it from several additional angles. One point to bear in mind is that other people literally can't think for us, right? How can I possibly think for you? My brain is in here. My mind is in here. Yours is over there. It's not even possible. And furthermore, when other people if you're accepting other people's ideas, other people are often wrong. Like a lot of times, right? So even if they were right, though, it wouldn't matter, because if you accept somebody else's idea and it's right in their context or for their purposes, it still might not be right for you. And the screenwriter is a great example of that. Look, the sample screenplay that he got, those long shots and stills and whatnot were probably exactly right for the sample he received. So the person whose mind he was mooching off of there was right. But it didn't serve him because it wasn't connected to reality in his mind. So it can't work there. So not only can other people not think for you, but even if they were right and you borrowed their ideas, they still can't work for you because they're not connected to reality. All right, I want to give a couple more examples that I think are interesting in terms of what this means methodologically and what the consequences are. Because the consequences, if there were no consequences for failing to think for yourself, if it didn't matter to your life, then it wouldn't matter. You just go, okay, I'll borrow your ideas and his ideas, and it'd be fine. But there are consequences, and the reason there are consequences is because of the reality connected to the mind thing. So let me give a couple examples. So suppose a young person is trying to decide whether to go to college. And we'll look at two different ways of doing this. And the first guy, he's raised in a family that both of his parents are lawyers, and there are lots of lawyers in the family. And from the day he could listen, his parents told him, "You're going to grow up and be a lawyer." And so he gets to, he's about 17 years old. He's trying to decide whether to go to college. And he's like, well, his friends ask him, what are you going to do? Well, I'm going to college, and then I'm going to go to law school. I'm going to spend 7 years of my life doing this. Then I'm going to be a lawyer, and then I'm going to be successful. And he knows this. Why? Because his parents told him that this is how you live a life, and this is how you achieve success. This is what you do. So he's just going with the flow. That's what his family, his tribe does, and so that's what he's going to do. Take another person in the exact same situation, 17, contemplating college, but instead of doing whatever his family might have told him is the right way to live, he stepped back and said, well, wait a minute. I'm 17, I've probably got, maybe 80 years of life if I'm lucky, maybe more. What do I want to do with those 80 years? How do I want to design my life? What matters to me? What would make me love my life? What would make my life wonderful? My parents want me to go into law. What's law all about? Let me look and see. Is this something that appeals to me? Not so much. What's this other thing? So he starts to look around and think. He's going by his own judgment rather than going with the tide of his family. Now, what choice this guy makes is irrelevant to our point here. It's not the decision that he makes. It's how he makes the decision. That's the difference that makes the difference. The difference between thinking for yourself consistently as a matter of principle and mustering the courage to stand by that, i.e. intellectual independence, that is the MO of good living. That's what it means to live a good life at the intellectual level. That's what it is. And so one of these guys is probably going to wade into a career that, just statistically, speaking, what are the chances of somebody who just wades into a career because somebody told them it was going to be the right one, being the exact best career for him? They're close to zero, right? The number. How many careers are there? You do the math, right? It's massively against his. The odds are massively against him. So you just can't stress this point enough. Thinking for yourself is key to living a good life. One more example on this that I think is helpful. You're probably familiar with the company, the failed tech company Theranos, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, but it was started by a Stanford dropout named Elizabeth Holmes. And she was extremely charismatic. She fancied herself the next Steve Jobs. She dressed like Steve Jobs. She called her product the iPhone of healthcare, or the iPod of healthcare, I think it was. And what she did is she went around gathering investments for her company. And what her company promised was that she could take a drop of blood from the prick of a finger, and with that, she could put it in her little box that she had, this little technology that she had developed, and that it would diagnose 200 possible diseases to see whether this person was at risk for these diseases. And it could do so on the cheap, like really inexpensively. This was massive, this idea, right? So she's going around gathering investors. And the people who invested $900 million in this were no morons. Larry Ellison, Henry Kissinger, who else was there? Schultz, Secretary of Defense Schultz, Secretary of State Schultz, excuse me. Who else was in there? Betsy DeVos. Her family invested in it. So these are intelligent people. These are people who typically do due diligence before they get into something. And there were real telltale signs that there was a problem here. Holmes' company was very hush-hush and very cult-like. If you disagreed or asked questions about anything in that company, you got fired, and then you got a notice that if you said anything about what's going on in the company, you would be in violation of agreements, non-disclosure agreements, and you would be sued. And Elizabeth Holmes had a lot of money. She was a billionaire at this time. How she got her other money is another story. But and they really pressured people. And if you were on the board and raised a question, she asked you to resign and did the same thing. You're not to say a word. There was not one scientist on the board of this science tech company, right? And there were several other sort of indications that if you were going to invest $100 million or $150 million, which some of these people did independently, if you were going to invest that kind of money, you would want to know, who is this person? What kind of company is this? What's the culture in this company, right? Thinking for yourself would involve, being intellectually independent would involve asking those kinds of questions. And apparently these people didn't do that. And what happened? They got burned big time. $900 million. This is almost $1 billion. So this is another indication of this matters. It matters in reality whether or not you go by your own judgment. Now, it's important to note that being intellectually independent it does not make you infallible, right? Maybe some of these people in the Theranos case, maybe some of them did do due diligence, right? And they just missed some things. That's possible. I'm far from me to shake a finger. I really don't know the full context there. It would be impossible for me to know that. So maybe some of them did due diligence. And you can err. You can do your best intellectually and still err. But this is not a mark against intellectual independence. It's a mark for it. Because the only way you can find out when you've erred and then correct your errors is by thinking for yourself again, figuring out, where did I err? What happened here? What did I do there? And then correcting for the future. You certainly can't turn to somebody else and let them do that thinking for you. It's not going to work. Mimicking doesn't work because it violates the relationship, the proper relationship between the mind and reality. I want to say a few words about experts, leaders, and groups, because I want to make very clear that I'm not denigrating any of them. There are experts, there are doctors, dance instructors, rock climbing guides. There are all sorts of experts out there who have knowledge that you don't have, that I don't have, and we go to them. Why? Because they know something we don't know. And we want to be able to take advantage of that knowledge. There's a huge value in other people's using their minds and the specialization of the fields that we go into. And we rely on experts all the time, and we have to. But we don't rely on, or we shouldn't rely on them blindly, right? If you go to a doctor and he's not making any sense, you're talking to him about some ailment and he's not making any sense to you, you don't go, well, he's a doctor. I'm just going to do whatever he says, right? So he says, oh, you've got cancer, and he can't explain or show you anything about it. And he goes, so we're going to hook you up to this chemo machine. You're like, no, you're not. Like, I need to understand what's going on here. That's how you deal with experts, always, if you are an independent thinker, if you are a person of intellectual independence. And the same is true with leaders. There are real leaders. A leader is basically a thought leader. That's what it means for somebody to be a leader, right? So Aristotle was a leader. He led the field in several areas, but he invented logic. He invented the field of deductive logic, the science of logic. He was also the first biologist. He was a leader in that field. Isaac Newton was a leader in the field of physics. Charles Darwin was a leader in the field of biology and evolutionary studies. Ludwig von Mises was a leader in economics. He wasn't the first economist, but he came up with a new idea in economics, a new approach to economics, and he started a new school and was a leader there. And you can learn from these people. But you never say, well, he's a leader, ergo anything he says, I'm going to agree with. That's relinquishing your mind. And a really good, obvious example of this is a leader in philosophy that I love, Ayn Rand, said a few things that were just downright wrong. She said homosexuality is immoral. It's just not true. And if I were throwing my judgment to Ayn Rand and say, well, whatever she says, there it goes. So you don't treat leaders that way. The way that you treat leaders as an independent thinker is you say, what does this person say that makes sense to me? What can I learn from this person? And you evaluate their ideas critically, just like you evaluate any other ideas critically, right? That's what it means to treat leaders and experts and the like properly, is you respect their context and what they're bringing to the table, and then you evaluate them. And the final authority is always your mind and your mind's assessment of the facts. That's what it means. Groups. We're a group here. There's nothing wrong with groups. Chess club is a group. A dance club is a group. Queen is a group. Who loves Queen, right? Especially after Bohemian Rhapsody. Groups are great as long as they're good groups, right? Antifa is a group too. MS-13 is a group. So what's the context and what is your judgment of this group? That's what matters. So there's no denigration of groups, experts, or leaders here. There's just recognition of what they are and what you are and what your mind is in relation to them. And that's what we're trying to keep straight. If someone ever asks or expects you to take his or her word, his or her say-so as truth, just because he said so, if anyone expects you to treat his or her mind as your final authority, that is a dogmatist. That is a cult leader. That is someone seeking to invalidate your mind and make you a blind follower. You run from that person as fast as you can. They are the most dangerous people in the world. And historically, this is what Mao and Hitler and all of the cult leaders, that's what they were. They were precisely that. They got people into their fold by saying, what I say is the truth, and you follow it, and then disaster followed. And that's another instance of the reason why this is so important. So you run from those people. If someone has an idea and he thinks it's true and that it's important enough that you should understand it and understand why it's true, then he should be able to explain that idea to you in clear, plain, simple language. If he can't do that, he either doesn't know it himself, he's just BSing you, he doesn't know that it's true himself, or even if he does know it and he's just a crappy communicator, you still can't relinquish your mind to him. And I'll give you a quick example of this that happened in my own life. So when my daughter Darcy was 18 months old, one of her eyes started crossing inward. It's called strabismus. But because she was 18 months old, when we took her to a doctor, the doctor was confused because usually strabismus shows up either much earlier or substantially later than that. And if it's earlier, then it's typically caused by a muscle problem. And if it shows up later, it's typically caused by a vision problem. But she was right in the middle, and so they couldn't tell whether it was a vision problem or a muscle problem or some combination of the two. And so Sarah and I sat down in this doctor's office, and he starts trying to explain to us his thoughts on this and what he thinks the treatment should be given the diagnosis and stuff. And he was not making any sense. I couldn't understand a word he was saying. Sarah, who was a nurse at the time and was fairly familiar with medical terminology, she couldn't understand what he was saying. We asked questions, his answers didn't make any sense either. So we walked out and we were like, okay, we're not going to go with this doctor. So we went to another doctor. We sat down with her and she started to explain and she was clear as day. Everything just made sense. Oh, okay, we understand that. And when she was done explaining, we were like, okay, well, we're going with you. We told her about this other doctor. We said, oh yeah, we saw Dr. So-and-so the other day, and he just couldn't get it. He didn't make any sense, so that's why we came to you. And she said, oh, he's a really good doctor. She said, if you had gone with him, you would have been in perfectly good hands. He's a really good doctor. But you can't. You can't go with somebody if they don't make sense to you. It's a complete relinquishment of your mind. And there was no way for us to know that he was a good doctor, and we can't even take her word that he's a good doctor, right? So there's no getting around this. There's no getting around the need for intellectual independence. Now I want to put a huge exclamation point on this next point. Nowhere is this more important than in philosophy. Philosophy is the fundamental science. It's the science that underlies all of the other ones. It's the philosophy that has the field called epistemology, which is a fancy word for theory of knowledge. How do we know what we know? How do we know what's true? How do we acquire and validate knowledge? If you go wrong on that, if you relinquish your mind on that question to somebody else, and I'll tell you how you know because I said so. That's how you know. Or you know because the group said so, or because general consensus said so, or because God said so and I'm in connection with him and therefore I can tell you what to do, or whatever. If you relinquish your mind at that level, that is catastrophic. Because that ripples through everything in your life. That means you don't know how to determine when you know something and when you don't. Or if you do think you know because you've accepted it from somebody else, you have no idea whether it's right or wrong. Your entire mind is just floating, unconnected to reality. It's imperative that you never, in the realm of philosophy in particular, relinquish your judgment. In the realm of morality, another branch of philosophy, morality tells you what is the standard of right and wrong. Is the standard self-sacrifice? Is that the thing to do? Should I sacrifice? Should I be self-interested? Should I go after my own values? Does self-interest mean doing whatever I want, regardless of its effects on me or other people? These questions have to be answered for you to know which one is true, and the only person who can answer them is you. If you just go, well, I learned in, my parents told me this, so I'm going to do it. I learned in Sunday school this thing, or my college professor told me this, or it's general consensus, ergo, that's what I do. Your mind doesn't know the thing you're pretending that it knows if you do that, right? So it's just imperative to never, ever, ever, in philosophy in particular, relinquish your mind to anyone else. So learn from good philosophers, be critical of their ideas and never accept their ideas until they make sense to you, until you understand them, until you know what stands under them and connects them to reality, until they make sense, meaning that they make it to the sensory level in your mind. That's when you accept the philosophic idea. And until you know, it's fine to say, I don't know. There's a lot of stuff we don't know. There's nothing wrong with it. It's a really good answer to a lot of questions. I have no idea yet. I haven't figured that out. That's a perfectly good answer, and stick with that when it's the truth. If that's the case, that's the case. All right. I want to mention a few, let's see. We're out at 10:15, correct? All right, good. I want to mention a few fallacies in particular to be aware of, and then we'll open the floor for questions. So any fallacy is bad for your mind, because what it means is you're using a false method of some sort to try to arrive at a conclusion, and that's going to botch your thinking and disrupt your mind's connection to reality. And there are hundreds of fallacies, so I can't get into all of them. But I do want to focus on a few that are particularly germane to this topic. The most obvious one is the appeal to authority, right? Appeal to authority is fallacious. Why? Because just because someone is an authority doesn't mean that they're right. Authorities are wrong a lot. They might be right on a given topic more often than not, but they're still not infallible. And the only way for you to know whether or not somebody's view is right is you can hear them out and say, oh, you think that's true? I'd love to hear your explanation for that. And if they give you an explanation that makes sense, you can say, okay, well, maybe you're thoroughly convinced, or maybe you're mostly convinced. Whatever the case, or maybe you're unconvinced. Whatever the case is, it is. And you want to recognize that as the case, and that's where you remain for the time being. And then maybe more information will come in, maybe something will contradict that, but it's always your judgment. So appeal to authority is false because the mere fact that somebody is an authority doesn't make him the standard of truth. Appeal to the masses, same thing. And these are pretty obvious, but it's good to, even though we know these things, it's good to review them. When I was putting my thoughts together for this talk, I felt like, I was like, this is a really nice review for me, because it's helping me to remember all this stuff in a way that sometimes you can lose sight of. You can lose sight of this big integration about what this thing is and why it matters. So even if this is review for you, I think it's good review. So appeal to the masses. Just because a bunch of people think something doesn't mean that the thing is true. And this we see this all the time in politics and things like global warming, right? Everybody knows the globe is warming. 99% of the scientists say that it's warming. And so there you get a mixture of appeal to the masses and appeal to authority. But the fact remains, do their arguments make sense? Is there evidence to support this, A? B, even if the globe is warming, what's the significance of that? Is that bad? Maybe it's good. We can't know, and it's not bad or good just because somebody said it's bad or good. It's bad or good depending on the facts and depending on your standard of value, right? If your standard of value is that man should never touch nature, that nature should be untouched by man, then anything man does is bad, whether it raises or lowers the temperature or does anything, right? So your standard of value really matters. This goes back to the point of this being most important in philosophy. But the very idea that just because a group of people agrees on something that it is therefore true is just fallacious, and it will disconnect your mind if you accept it to any extent. To any extent. Let me say a quick word on extents here. I like always to think of virtue as a plateau that terminates at a slope, right? And the terminus here, where the slope begins, I think of as the law of excluded middle. All right? So the truth is here, or what you know is here, or being fully virtuous is here. Whatever the good thing is up on the plateau. If you step over that, if you relinquish your judgment just a little bit, then you're on that slope. You've gone over the law of excluded middle. The law of excluded middle says either you're going by your own judgment or you're not, in this case. If you step over that line, then you're not fully going by your own judgment. And you've already violated the principle, so now there's no principle to stop you from sliding down the slope and doing it as much or as frequently as it might seem appropriate or feel comfortable to you, right? So it's good to think of it that way. I call it the principle and the plateau and the slope. And so if you relinquish at all on any of these points, you have then stepped onto the slippery slope. And then it's just a matter of degree. The bad and vices, they all come in degrees. The good is a solid thing. It's one thing. It's another fallacy, and this one is one that was identified by Ayn Rand. It's called the argument from intimidation. And this one is really, really popular nowadays. And the basic form of the argument is that only a rotten person or only a monster would, or only an idiot would accept this idea. And the idea, the purpose here is to put psychological pressure on you, like, oh, if you accept that idea, you must be an idiot. And to sort of cow you into accepting an idea or to rejecting an idea, whichever way the case is going, without any discussion of whether or not the idea is true. Right? So they're using this psychological pressure to avoid having to discuss that. It's the way that Ayn Rand put it, is it's the substitution of psychological pressure for rational argument. And just be aware of this. Ayn Rand wrote a beautiful essay on it titled The Argument from Intimidation. It's in The Virtue of Selfishness, and I urge you to read that. I wrote a recent article following up on that because I found she had written in her journals a short excerpt that she had cut from that article before it was published. And I found it while reading some of her works. I was like, oh my God, that's really good material. I mean, I can see why she cut it, but it was so good. So I wrote a follow-up on it that just recently, and you can look that up as well. But that's a fallacy you should be intimately familiar with because it happens all the time. People are trying to intimidate you into accepting their ideas. There's a species of this fallacy that I want to focus on, and this is the final fallacy I want to cover. There's a species of this fallacy that is called the argument by jargon or the argument by gibberish. It goes by different terms. And it's also sometimes called the argument to befuddle. Right? It's all the same thing. But what it is this. The person trying to get you to accept his idea either uses a bunch of jargon that makes it sound like he's so much more intelligent than you that eventually he just sort of wears you out and you're supposed to be like, oh, God, I don't even understand what all those terms mean. He must be really, really smart. I'm just gonna say, hey, you know what you're talking about, I don't. Or he'll use gibberish, meaning he just goes on and on and on, making no sense at all. Again, sort of to make it sound like he's got some highfalutin argument that your meager mind just can't handle, right? So this is all a way of trying to intimidate you into just capitulating and saying, okay, you must be right, because I can't even follow that. And it's often called the argument to befuddlement because the goal is to befuddle you, is to just make you go, oh, I have no idea what you're talking about, and finally to collapse on it. And this is very common. It's really common in philosophy. It's really common in philosophy. Philosophers love to pull this stuff. And here's the thing about philosophy. Philosophy, unlike certain highly specialized fields, astrophysics and immunology and some of these things that are really, really technical and there's a lot of terms, philosophy is not that way. Bad philosophers have made their fields that way, but real philosophy is not that way. Real philosophy is accessible to any active mind. Any active mind. And all real good philosophy can and should be done in plain English. In the rare event that some new idea comes into philosophy and a new name needs to be given to it, Ayn Rand invented a new branch of psychology called psychoepistemology. Big term, but the reason is because it has to do with psychology and it has to do with epistemology, which is a long-standing branch of philosophy that just involves the theory of knowledge. And so she put those terms together. But by and large, but even if somebody uses that term, you can explain what it means in very simple, clear English. Psychoepistemology is the science that studies the relationship between the automatic functions of the subconscious and the volitional functions of the conscious mind, okay? So thinking is volitional. You have to choose to think. But I can make something come into your mind without you choosing it to be there. Watch, here we go. Eeny, meeny, miny, boom, right there for all of you. You didn't have any choice, okay? So there's a thing there, right? And because there's a thing, there's something to study. How do these things work, right? So even if somebody has a highfalutin term in philosophy, it should be very easy to explain what that thing is and how it functions in plain English. And if a philosopher can't do that, he's a quack. He's not a philosopher. Okay. I want to summarize what we've talked about. So, what is independent thinking? Or intellectual independence? What is intellectual independence? I like to boil it down to the three-ingredient thing we started with here. It's thinking for yourself as a matter of principle, so always, in all contexts, and maintaining the courage to uphold that commitment. So thinking for yourself, committing to do that all the time as a matter of principle, and then maintaining the courage to do that even when it gets difficult. Why is this good? Because it keeps your mind connected to reality, which is where the values are. All the good things that we need come from reality. All the things that serve our lives, friendships, romance, hobbies, career, freedom, proper governments, all of these things, they come from reality. They're not floating up in the sky. So if you want to have them, you've got to keep your mind connected to reality. Intellectual independence as an MO enables you to self-correct. You're going to make errors, we all do, except for me, I don't make errors, everybody else does. You're going to make errors, and the only way you can self-correct is by doing due diligence on your own. You can talk to other people, you can reference other people, but you still have to make the call. And the final reason that intellectual independence is important is because of all of those things, it is, in fact, the key to flourishing in life. It's the key to living a wonderful, beautiful life, a life that is the very best life that you can live. So here's to independent thinking as a matter of principle and with the courage to do this for your lifetime. Thank you.
Hi.
Yes. Hi.
So intellectual independence is very radical in normal culture. Whether it's reliance on experts or the appeal to masses, how do you deal with people who are close to you in life who try to pressure you or who condemn you for not listening to these people? My guess, because they get defensive when you say, "Oh, I thought about it." That's how I know they're wrong. Or, so how do you talk to them without them being defensive? Because I'm guessing the reason that they are being hard on you is because they follow the experts, they follow the masses.
I would go to 2 points. Did everybody hear the question? No?
Sorry.
Okay, I'm going to repeat it since some people didn't. How do you deal with people who have a view that you oppose, and you tell them, well, the reason I oppose it is because I thought about it and here are my reasons behind it. Yet they're still angry at you for not, or upset with you in some way for not towing the line anyway. Depends on how, they're being irrational there in a sense. So it depends on how bad that irrationality is. You don't want to deal with people who are super irrational because you can't do anything with them. But assuming best circumstances here, so this is somebody who's kind of confused or whatever, and it's a friend, you want to say, look, I think everybody needs to think through things for themselves and make decisions based on what makes sense to them. Do you think otherwise? So I would pose a question to them. Because if they have to answer that question, it's going to make them feel very uncomfortable to say, no, I don't think that. Right? That would be a weird thing to say. You can also ask people a question that Ayn Rand used a lot that is really, really good at helping to keep people connected to reality is when somebody's got some conclusion, you say, how did you arrive at that conclusion? Or what facts of reality gave rise to that in your mind? What are the facts that support this idea? Any version of that.
I feel like 12 years of med school.
He says 12, so 12 years of med school. Okay, well, here's another thing. You have to determine whether the thing you're trying to answer, whether you need to hold a position on it, and whether he needs to, and whether you guys need to agree on it at all. There are medical professionals, let's take nutrition. There are nutritional professionals who completely disagree with each other, and they're all very highly schooled. They've been through all of it. So some things are really complex, and you and I and others, we don't have the knowledge to hold a position on it. You know, the best you can do is you read some papers and you go, this one makes the most sense to me, but I can only put so much time into this. That's what I do with nutrition. And I read a few articles here and there on nutrition. I try to keep my mind connected to what kind of makes sense to me, but it's a really complicated field. So you can't expect to have perfect knowledge in all these fields. It's just not possible. So you have to be selective about what you're willing and what you need to put time into. And where you don't know, you just say, I don't know. And say that to them too. You can say, well, here's my view based on what I've studied. And so if you have a different view, that's fine. If you want to talk about it, you could put your facts on the table, I could put mine, and we can see where it goes. But you're never going to get along you're never going to have full agreement with anyone on anything. I have friends in this room and elsewhere who share the exact same philosophical ideas that I do. Yeah, we disagree on all sorts of ways to apply that philosophy even. The application of ideas can get really difficult. So don't put a demand on yourself or on your friends or on conversations that's impossible. Okay. So just be careful.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
You spoke about having the courage to challenge authorities. What about Ayn Rand in Russia made no public statements about what she thought about communism. And students in colleges today, if they have a militantly leftist professor who might punish them for their public opinions, or children who have parents who get abusive when challenged and so forth, what are the limits to courage?
Good question, really good question. So did everybody hear that? I think that was clear, okay. So there are times when you should not say what you think. And those include when saying what you think could end your life, put you in jail, put you in a gulag. So in the case of Ayn Rand, there was good reason not to speak out against the communist regime, particularly in those early years where it was really cutthroat and nasty. And she saw what was coming better than most. So she had good reason to not want to say anything. She also, part of the reason she changed her name was to protect her family back there. Like she foresaw this problem. So yeah, you definitely, here's the way I like to put this. Virtue owes nothing to vice. So if somebody is bad and does something or attacks you verbally or physically or whatever, you don't owe that person anything. You don't owe him the truth. You don't owe him any promises that you may have given him. If he is trying to harm you, whether physically or in any other way, he is wrong and you are not, and you are right, presumably, and you don't owe him anything. So you don't owe him the sticking your neck on a chopping block, and the same goes for people or maybe college students in a really hardcore leftist campus environment today. If speaking up about your ideas is going to mean that you fail in your courses or something like that, and I don't know how bad things are, I'm blissfully out of university life. I don't know how bad things are there, but if just hypothetically speaking, if it means you're going to be punished severely in your grades and stuff, and that's going to have serious impact on your career and your life, keep your mouth shut. You don't owe this guy anything. You don't owe some postmodernist professor your view of the truth. Oftentimes, it's simply enough if somebody says something you disagree with, you say, I just disagree with that. But you don't even owe the person that. Now, sometimes in a classroom you can get away with it, and it may help to speak up for a few reasons. A, it exercises your mind and your ability to argue and make judgments, and that can be good. It's also good if you've got some points that the other students haven't heard, and if you can make the conversation go in a direction that helps to enlighten them to some extent, or get them to start asking the kinds of questions that constitute good thinking, then that can be really helpful. But it is highly contextual. So the end answer to all of this is it's contextual, and you should not do anything that's going to ruin your life in the process of doing it. There's a time for saying give me liberty or give me death. Don't get me wrong, but that time is probably not today, and so just be careful.
Okay.
So it's clear that independent thinking is extremely valuable and can free you in many ways. But my question to you is, are there any areas or walks of life where dependent thinking or blindly following someone could be beneficial at the end of the day?
So, everybody hear that? Are there any areas of life where dependent thinking or blindly following someone can be beneficial? I can't think of any instance outside of a game that you might do where you blindfold somebody and say, all right, you're going to follow me now because... And there are games in team building. I used to do team building exercises for companies, and there was a game where you did that. But you're not really blindly following, because the whole purpose of the game was to learn to trust your coworkers. So the idea was they're not going to walk you into a whitewater river. So I can't think of an instance, and it wouldn't make any sense for there to be an instance, right? The way that you achieve knowledge is by keeping your mind connected to reality. The way that you achieve values is by keeping your mind connected to reality. The way you avoid disvalues is by keeping your mind connected. Everything that's good comes from your mind being connected to reality. So anything that pulls away from that in any way, shape, or form is anti-life. So I can't think of an instance, and in principle, there isn't one. So I can say with certainty that there's not, but you shouldn't accept my word on that. It's a good question.
I got to independently
think it through. Yeah, exactly. I don't want to dogmatize and say no, there's no. But in principle, from my perspective, there's no possible way that there could be an instance.
Got it. Thank you. I like that answer.
You're welcome.
Okay, I totally agree with the flourish. The key of flourish is intellectual independence. But I have a question. In matters of public policies, when the power conquers people conscious, how do you protect and strengthen intellectual dependence?
I confess that I am extremely poor in deciphering heavy accents, and you have a beautiful accent and a beautiful voice, but I had no idea what you just asked.
Okay. In matters of public policies, when power conquers people consciousness, how do you protect and strengthen intellectual independence?
Did anyone sitting near that mic make that out fully?
Okay, I can say.
I apologize for.
Okay, in matters.
Kyle, are you following this?
Some.
In matters of public policies, when powers conquer.
Public politics?
Yes.
Okay.
Public policy.
Yeah, when powers conquer people consciousness, how do you protect intellectual independence?
When power
Conquers people conscious.
conquers people. Okay, got it. So in politics, when power conquers people, so when tyranny sets in, and as is happening in Venezuela, for instance, today. How do you protect intellectual independence? It's difficult, right? There are two ways to deal with people, by persuasion or by force. And when force comes into the picture, it makes persuasion impossible, because if somebody puts a gun to your head and says you're going to accept this idea, persuasion is out. Now you're not being persuaded. It's just you're either going to die or you're going to accept this person's view. So under true and full tyranny, intellectual independence, to the extent that you have it, it actually serves no purpose, because you can't act on your judgment. The whole point of thinking, the whole point of judging, is ultimately to act so that you can live. That's the purpose of this thing. And if you can't do that, if you can't act on your judgment, then your judgment, you can think in your mind, but it becomes fantasy because you can't act on it. So when a country is being taken over by tyranny, by tyrannical leaders, what the people in that country need urgently to do is, and if the guns have already come out, what those people need urgently to do is to kill the leaders. You have to kill them. they're trying to kill you, you have to kill them. So that's the first thing. The people of the mind have to get together and they have to go, we're going to do this thing. We're putting an end to this tyranny. Now, in something like the United States, where there's some tyranny and lots of freedom, and it's just this nasty mixture, you don't go and kill your leaders because we're not far enough along that would be the right thing to do. So it's highly contextual. On a personal level, what you can do is really understand the arguments for liberty. Really grasp why it is that liberty is morally correct. It's a political ideal with a moral foundation. What is that moral foundation? Why is it moral that liberty is the law of the land, right? And it's not the law of the land because a lot of people said so. And it's not the law of the land because somebody determined that the Bible said so. And it's not the law of the land even because the founders of the United States said so. There are certain facts about the requirements of human life that make liberty correct. And we who want to defend liberty, we have to know those facts so that two things happen when we know those facts. We have the moral certainty of our position because we know it's true. And so this gives us incentive to fight, and it gives us power and strength in many ways. And then we can explain these ideas to other people in a way that makes sense to them in plain English so that they can go, now I get it. There's really an argument for liberty. It's not just, well, everybody who's for liberty is on our side. No, because different people mean different things by liberty. Hitler claimed he was for freedom. Freedom to him meant the freedom to follow the Volk, and the Volk had to follow him, and that was freedom. So just latching onto this is why I have a beef with aspects of the libertarian movement, is they want to just say, well, if you're for liberty, you're with us, and we're all in the same thing, we all want liberty. No, you have to answer the question, what is liberty, what undergirds it, what anchors it to reality, and if you don't know that, then you're actually dealing with what Ayn Rand called floating abstractions. These ideas just floating up here with no connection to reality, and you can't explain to other people why they should accept it, and you yourself don't even know that liberty is morally correct. You're just going along because the crowd is going along. That's not a good way to fight for liberty. So, if this sounds at all, I get worked up on this because I'm passionate. So I don't mean to be barking at you. Your question is excellent, and it's a really important thing. But the point is that there's a real urgency today for people who want to defend liberty to really understand what undergirds it. And the way you do it is through intellectual independence. Do not just accept the ideas just because Rothbard said something, just because von Mises said something, just because Larry Reed said something. It doesn't matter if you're just looking at what they said. You have to know what anchors it. And you either do or you don't. Which one is it? Right? We've got to answer that question. And if you don't know, figure it out. Read the people. I advocate that you read Ayn Rand because I think that she has answered these questions very, very well. So I advocate that you read her, but you should read her critically. I always tell people when I first was reading Ayn Rand, I read her with her book in one hand and a dagger in the other. Because I was like, if you say something wrong, I'm going to get you for it, right? You want to be critical about it. And then, when I got done reading her books, I was like, this is right. I dropped the dagger. I'm like, oh my God. So that's where I am on this stuff. But everyone has to do his or her own thinking. There's no getting around that. So for people in foreign lands where they're struggling with this stuff, make it an MO that you guys will engage in independent thinking as a matter of principle and muster the courage to do it. Don't get yourself killed. Courage doesn't mean charging out there when you're just going to get slaughtered for doing so. You want to stay alive, but fight tyranny intellectually. That's the only way to beat it. And when the guns have to come out, aim well. Thank you.